Welcome to Newshour. Well, what a day, diplomacy and drama in Israel. It was an afternoon that included the removal of opposition members of the Knesset, Ayman, Odeh and Ofer Cassif, for attempting to protest in favour of recognising a Palestinian state. Donald Trump has addressed the Knesset in Jerusalem, of course, becoming the first sitting US president in decades to do so before flying to Egypt for the Middle East peace ceremony in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, the visit comes as a long negotiated truce between Israel and Hamas takes effect, involving the release, as we've seen, of 20 Israeli hostages in exchange for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. The deal, brokered through mediation by the US, Egypt and Qatar, also includes a partial Israeli troop withdrawal from Gaza and renewed coordination on humanitarian access. Officials describe it as the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in 2 years of conflict. Yet it unfolds against deep public skepticism and complex regional rivalries. President Trump's 7-hour regional tour is both symbolic and strategic. We'll have the latest from Israel, and later we'll be joined by a political analyst who has criticised this gathering as more political performance than permanent solution. But first, let's cross to our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Blake Sifton, for the latest on the ceasefire's implementation and reaction to Donald Trump's Knesset address.
Guy, President Trump has really arrived in Israel today to a hero's welcome. And it's really something of a victory tour. He is wildly popular in Israel for his efforts to see this deal through and to have the hostages released. When he arrived, he was met with a red carpet ceremony at Ben Gurion Airport by Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as President Herzog. He has been awarded Israel's highest civilian honor, and his name has been chanted by the thousands, the tens of thousands of people gathering in Hostage Square today to watch these images of the Israeli hostages being released, all 20 hostages released, and to really experience an outpouring of joy and relief after 2 years of seeing them in captivity and after 2 years of protests in Hostage Square demanding that the government win their release. Now, President Trump went to Jerusalem. He went to the Knesset after arriving. He met with Prime Minister Netanyahu as well as Jared Kushner and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. He then met with families of the hostages. Now, his message, his central message, as he's been flying here, as he's been arriving, has really been that the war is over. Before he left, before he boarded Air Force One, he was asked directly, is the war over? He said the war is over. And when he arrived at the Knesset, he was asked again by a member of the press, is the war over? He replied emphatically, yes. And when asked what would happen if Hamas didn't comply with the rest of their obligations under this deal, he just said they'll comply, refusing to entertain the idea that if they're not demilitarized or disarmed through negotiations, that Israel may return to war, because that is the message and that is the demand of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners. They want Israel to return to war now that the hostages are released, if Hamas, in their mind, is not dismantled. But President Trump has provided guarantees that that won't happen, and he seems intent on making sure the war is definitively over. When he arrived at the Knesset, he was greeted with a 2.5-minute standing ovation. In his speech to the Knesset, he praised the work of Steve Witkoff, of Jared Kushner, of Marco Rubio, and especially of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he said of the moment, this is a historic day of a new Middle East. Following his visit to Israel, when he's wrapped up here, President Trump will head on to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where he will co-chair a major summit of world leaders that will be participating in talks about the future of Gaza. And it's really an effort to keep up the momentum of this international pressure that's led to this first phase of the deal. of course, now that the hostages have been released, the living hostages, and now that Palestinian prisoners are also being released, we still need to see the release of the bodies of deceased Israeli hostages. But essentially now this first part is complete. We've had a cessation of hostilities, increasing aid into Gaza. More is on the way. However, the real work needs to be done now to see the rest of this deal through. There are major obstacles that need to be overcome, including the disarmament of Hamas, the demilitarization of Gaza, this transitional Palestinian government of technocrats that's meant to take over from Hamas. We still need to see who that government will be comprised of and how they will be chosen. Hamas have said they want a say in that process. And crucially, the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza is tied to the progress of this international stabilization force that's meant to enter Gaza and assist with demilitarization. Israel continues to occupy some 53% of Gaza, so this international stabilization force will be vital. And we still do not know which countries will contribute to that force, when it will be assembled, and when it will be deployed. So we'll be watching very closely for updates on that at this summit, for announcements or commitments from other countries. But President Trump does have plenty of work ahead as he and other world leaders discuss the post-war governance of Gaza, security and reconstruction, and really work to see that his entire 20-point peace plan can come to fruition.
Well, joining us now from New York is John Kavulich, Senior Editor at Issue Insight. John, thank you. Always good to see you. Before we dive into the detail of what's been a momentous day, let's just briefly watch an event that unfolded in the Knesset earlier. Okay, John, two members there thrown out, as we've seen, for holding up a sign calling on US President Donald Trump to recognise Palestine. I suppose on the one hand, you could say that this is disruptive, signs of divisions, etc. On the other hand, you could say, well, it's a sign that the Knesset is a place that will tolerate different points of view. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so much for democracy and decorum. President Trump looked out over that hall, saw those security men grabbing both of the members, and part of him wished that he was one of the security people, and the other part was that he wished he was the one that would have said, "You're fired, get out." So very performative, it's symptomatic of how I know our Congress is, that one side says something and they clap, the other side says something and they boo, and we have these divisions. What took place in the Knesset today with respect to President Trump's speech seemed to be more reflective of the kind of audience you would see either in the People's Republic of China or North Korea.
I mean, John, you used that word performative. You speaking there very elegantly about this sort of the platitudes that we saw earlier and the praise that was heaped on the president. I mean, do you think that's necessarily a problem? Is it, in a sense, although we might find that approach unpalatable at times, has it nevertheless almost been part of the success that's been achieved, do you think, in any way?
In part, yeah, absolutely. It is his, as they would call, a shtick. It is his script. The challenge, though, becomes when he uses the primary components of his script, no matter who the audience is. So he'll go to a funeral and talk about how the election was stolen from him and how he has solved 8 wars and how he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, as he will also do it at an event like today. And what's remarkable about this day so far is that the president's running about 2.5 hours behind schedule on his way to Egypt. And now for the past 2+ hours, you've had 28 heads of state and heads of government, and then representative of the European Council and the UN, sitting in Sharm el-Sheikh with President el-Sisi of Egypt, watching President Trump going, oh my God, if this is what he did there, what are we in for?
It's very interesting. I suppose, yeah, you're almost pointing to a scenario where, if I'm very pleased with your analysis on this show, I tell you you're the greatest political analyst who's ever lived, and then you say something that I don't like, and you become the worst political analyst ever to exist. And I suppose it's difficult to. But is there not a predictability about that, though, in diplomatic terms? Does it not make it easy to negotiate with?
He is predictable in that you can be friend at 9 o'clock, you can be enemy at 9:10, and you can be friend again at 9:20. And his colleagues, he doesn't believe them to be peers, because no one is his equal. But his colleagues, heads of state, heads of government, they are getting and understanding the gaming aspect of dealing with him since his first term and now into his second. However, it still doesn't negate that none of these people want to be on the end of one of his attacks. Even if they know there's a strategy to deal with it, withstand it, recover from it, and move on, they still don't want it, because you can never be 100% accurate in knowing to what level he's going to go after you. And so you've got those folks that are sitting there. I'll give one example. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, he will be in attendance. His government officially put out that the UK was very much involved in the creation of the plan, in dealing with Israel, dealing with all aspects of it. And the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has referred to that description as the UK government is delusional. They had nothing to do with it. And then Steve Witkoff, the President Trump's envoy to Israel, said, oh yes, the UK did have something to do with it. So if you're Keir Starmer, it's like a ping pong ball. So none of them want to set themselves up for this. The problem is they all know it's coming. They just don't know when and how large it's going to be.
Very interesting indeed. Okay, let's look now at the hostages. Obviously, the great celebrations at the release of the hostages today. But do you think there may have been an overshadowing today of the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
And a polite understatement on your part. Look at the coverage that we've seen. We have the primary presenters from all the networks, or from many networks throughout the world, descended upon Israel today, or yesterday and today, doing stories about the hostage families, about everything relating to the return of the hostages alive, and then the return of their bodies, and their recovery and the resilience of Israel, etc. Well, how many governments in advance of this said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, hey, if we're coming in to cover this, we want unfettered access into Gaza. We want our reporters to get into Gaza at the same time. So a split screen on what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Gaza. And that wasn't done. Either the heads of state and heads of government didn't ask, or they asked and the government of Israel said it's not going to happen. But if you're in Israel today, you're somewhat happy. The hostages are released, the bodies are coming home. But if you're in Gaza, you used earlier the word war. If you're a 15-year-old boy or girl in Gaza, and you've been experiencing what you have the last 2 years, and you've lost family members. Is the war for you really over? Or has it just been redefined from drones and bombs and missiles and bullets to now you have a barren landscape? And what did the media and what did Israel focus on the last week? How wonderful it is that now all these Gazans could return to Gaza City. A Gaza City of what? They can't live there. There's no infrastructure. So we're applauding the fact that there's a nice column of people walking along the Mediterranean Sea, like they've gone from their summer home to their winter home. So there's a lot to happen here, and it's not going to be attractive during the next months, because when these reporters and anchors leave Israel today and tomorrow, there's not going to be a big focus on on Gaza, and President Trump is not going to be focusing on Gaza, because for him, it was about the hostages in Israel, the peace prize, which he still wants. He looks at that and says, are they really going to focus on, did I get Israel to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza, or did I get Arab and Muslim nations to pay? I think he's looking, been there, done that. I'm going home and have a Coca-Cola and a cheeseburger.
Yeah, some very powerful points there, John. I mean, you've written extensively on this, of course, like many other topics. One of the things that you've said is that Israel has been strengthened while Gaza has been reduced to the margins of discourse. How does this perception influence the current, or how has it influenced the current phase of negotiations, do you think?
It's always who has the gold rules. I think the late Shah of Iran, once said that. And that's the same here. President Trump focused not on Gaza, not on the Palestinians. He focused on the Israelis, because the Israelis were the aggressor. You look at Ukraine and Russia, and President Trump has focused on pressuring Ukraine, the victim, and pressuring Russia, the aggressor. Neither has worked to stop the conflict. But in the case of Gaza, you had one side inflicting all the damage. And so it was fairly easy for him to weigh in and use leverage with Prime Minister Netanyahu to say, look, in essence, I'm a real estate guy. You've leveled Gaza. What else can you destroy? You're just going to be spending money on missiles and drones and that. There's nothing left to blow up. And if there is anything that you want, it's underground or it's already dead. So look at what you can get, what the upside is. The upside is you stop it and focus on getting the hostages back, focus on your reelection, focus on your corruption trial. And interesting that President Trump did bring that up in his speech to the Knesset, that the president of Israel should pardon the prime minister of Israel. And so I think it was pretty much of an easy path. And as I said, President Trump looks at this and he knows that the focus of the media, the focus domestically in the United States, his base, his Make America Great Again base, members of the United States Congress, House and Senate, still majority overwhelmingly support the state of Israel. We still give the state of Israel nearing $4 billion a year in assistance, which makes no sense considering Israel has $250 billion in foreign reserves. But President Trump is I go now to Egypt, I sit and have a dear leader moment with all of them. They'll go around the room, they'll all say how great I am. Maybe President el-Sheikh will announce a gold pyramid to be added to Luxor in President Trump's honor. I get on Air Force One and I go home and I check off this box, because reconstructing Gaza doesn't really get me anything. And lastly, he looks at the European Union in that 2 years. What did we see the European Union do to support Gaza? Well, they discussed removing Israel from the Eurovision music contest, and they discussed not having Israel participate in football matches, and they discussed removing removing Israel from some of the EU programs. But who blocked them? Germany, Italy, France, and whose three heads of state and heads of government are in Egypt awaiting President Trump? Meloni of Italy, Macron of France, and Merz of Germany.
Okay, let's turn to Sharm el-Sheikh now. I mean, you've described this summit as primarily performative, built around what you've called dear leader moments. Can you just explain a bit more about that?
It's going to be 27 people, or 28 people around a table, and they're all first going to congratulate President Trump on his vision, on the fact that he stayed with the process, on the fact that only he could do it. They'll likely also compliment Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, because politically that's just a smart thing to do, maybe even Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. But this is all about an opportunity for these leaders in some countries that did nothing to help Gaza, but also didn't do anything to punish Israel during the last 2 years, just basically sitting on the sidelines. And now they're all saying President Trump's the greatest. This is President Trump's idea. We support President Trump's idea. So what they're also doing is saying, this isn't us, this is you, with the exception of Keir Starmer. But they're saying, President Trump, this is your baby, but we're here for you, Donald. I think, though, the biggest mistake that's been made with respect to this meeting now in Egypt was the announcement initially that President Trump had gotten President el-Sisi of Egypt to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he's not going because of some religious occasion or something. To me, that is political malpractice. It's political negligence, because when would Prime Minister Netanyahu have an opportunity to walk into a room with a lot of people that don't like him, with President Trump's arm around him, and the one to watch would be President Erdogan of Turkiye? I mean, just, if nothing else, that photo of the three of them would be, constructive, instructive, and not particularly something President Erdogan would certainly want to do. But it's astounding to me why Prime Minister Netanyahu said no to this. Really, really strange.
Yeah, it's certainly a big surprise, and most analysts we've spoken to throughout the day are also scratching their heads. John, one of the other things that you've said is that you use the phrase political radiation poisoning, suggesting that leaders actually are risking harm through association. What do you mean by that, and what do you define those risks to be?
The primary risks are the unknown. We talked about that. These leaders know that they are likely to face incoming political fire from President Trump. I mean, they're really confident they're going to get it. They just don't know when. They don't know how long it's going to last. They don't know what's going to be the recovery. But they also know that right now they need to try to avoid being in his line of fire. The only way to do that is to, on the performance side, the dear leader side, is to just suck up to him, give him big wet kisses, a compliment that his tie is perfect, compliment him on everything. And doing that, though, they risk problems with their domestic constituencies, because particularly in Europe, there have been a lot of protests during the last 2 years over or about what the Israeli Defense Forces has done in Gaza. Meaning, okay, you want Hamas, but did you really need to level an entire population's infrastructure? 2.3 million people, basically nowhere to live. And so these governments need to be careful, and that's why I call it sort of political, radioactive, that they want to be near Donald Trump, who can be radioactive, but not so near that then they go home and they potentially get voted out of office, or their party loses seats in their parliament because they're perceived as too close to this guy. And what hasn't changed from 2 days ago to yesterday today, there are people who feel that Prime Minister Netanyahu is a war criminal, that feel President Trump is a war criminal because the U.S. has provided the means for Israel to do what it's doing. And for other heads of state, heads of government, are perceived to have done nothing. And domestic constituencies can be a pretty powerful thing, particularly with elections coming up.
John, can I ask you for a psychological viewpoint? I mean, you've spoken there about the gushing, plentiful compliments that are almost required when engaging with President Trump. I think if I were walking around the A News studios and people were telling me all day long that I was a colossus and that in 1,000 years people would be praising my name, at some point I would feel that it's unlikely that all of this is genuine, that possibly people can't mean it all. Does that matter to President Trump, or is it an irrelevance to him?
Well, you obviously have a deeper character than I would say that President Trump has. If you look at President Trump as a role model, do you really want him as a parent? Do you really want him as a husband? Do you really want him as a teacher? This is a very selfish man, a man that looks at everything in terms of not only the visual, as we hear him at speeches, what a good-looking audience, what a good-looking boy, what a good-looking woman. Oh, you're beautiful. It's about appearance to him because of his television background. And so you have someone that has substantial character flaws, and I'm not talking about him as president, but just as a human being. So when he walks around the building, the West Wing of the White House, and is referred to as the second coming of the guy that walked on water, he doesn't eventually, after the 10th person, say, all right, who's joking? He starts to believe this. And so, from him, reinforcement does not raise questions as it might to you or to me. Reinforcement to him is reinforcement. And therefore, if he does suspect, maybe these people are making fun of me, but I'm going to err on the side of they believe it. And which one of them is going to admit that they're making fun of Donald Trump?
Yeah.
None of them.
Very interesting, very interesting. Anyway, back to what's being discussed at this event. President Erdogan has called for $100 billion in reparations for Gaza. How credible is that figure? And also, what political message do you think that is sending?
The political message is the one he's been sending since this started, which is Israel started it. Israel's responsible for it. It was, back in the days of President George W. Bush, we had then Secretary of State Colin Powell go to the United Nations when saying, hey, the reason that we're invading Iraq is because of the weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to be there. So that we now have an environment where within, I'm gonna admit something that's embarrassing, but I lost my train of thought. Complete. Would you give me that question quickly again, and I'll get back to it.
John, of course, there are an amazing number of very elegant thoughts rushing around, so I'm not at all surprised that occasionally you use one. Look, I'd just like, if I could, to return to one of your famous quotes. You've created this image in something that you wrote recently where you spoke about swollen hands and tired tongues, capturing the tension between this praise that you've spoken about and also the sort of policy realities. We've spoken about President Trump and his character and his requirement for this continuous praise and adoration. But do you also see what's happened today achieving some substance beyond the optics?
It could, the swollen hands and the tongues. That's about shaking hands and talking. How great Trump is. There is a potential, and now my head is now coming back to President Erdogan and the 50 billion and the 100 billion. He for 2 years he's been saying that Israel is responsible for this, and as Secretary of State Colin Powell said, it was you break it, you own it. And so that's President Erdogan's message to Israel. You broke Gaza, you have to fix it. Now, a year ago at the UN General Assembly, in a meeting, I asked him, should Israel pay and will Israel pay? And he said, John, Israel should pay, absolutely. Will they pay? No. He said, the world community is going to pay. You're going to pay. Taxpayers are going to pay. Turkey is going to pay. He said, Israel, they're not going to pay a dime for what they did. Recently, though, he has said that Israel, $100 billion. That works out to about 47,000 per 2.3 million people in Gaza. Another earlier estimate, the United Nations, was 50 billion, so about like 27,000 per person. The question is, who's going to put up all of this money? Even for Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia combined, that's a lot of money. And Egypt certainly doesn't have the money. Jordan doesn't have that money. Turkiye doesn't have that kind of wealth. Turkiye has other platforms it can use to deliver, but it doesn't have that kind of wealth. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. In terms of the meeting today, I don't know President Erdogan can go around the table and say who agrees with me that Israel should pay for this. And I don't know if he's going to want to bring that up in front of President Trump. Now, President Trump, during his speech today, has said that rich nations, really rich nations, the richest nations have all agreed to reconstruct Gaza. I'm hoping that is not going to be the case, because the message it sends to a government that if you can go in and do what Israel did to Gaza without being required to do it, the level of destruction, and then being able to walk away from it and that others pay for it, what does that say to Russia and Ukraine? What does it say to other conflicts? It's basically a get out of jail free card. You can go in, do whatever you want, kill as many people as 67,000 plus people, and just walk away from it, because there's always going to be somebody out there with money that some government is going to strong arm. But all of this depends on there being a Donald Trump as a president of the United States. In 3.5 years, that's no longer going to be the case. And I think I can be fairly confident to say that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of change in Gaza for those 2.3 million people in 3.5 years. It's going to take a long, long time.
It's also going to be a very long time, John, before another Donald Trump reemerges. And we thank you very much indeed for your analysis. We know you're a very busy man, particularly today. So thank you so much for joining us from New York.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, from Jerusalem then to Sharm el-Sheikh. It's been a day defined by diplomacy and display as the ceasefire begins and regional leaders meet to discuss Gaza's reconstruction. The challenge now is how to turn symbolism into strategy. Well, that is all for this edition of Newshour from all of us here at A News. Thanks for being with us.